The sea is a dangerous and unforgiving place, ready to swallow up all those unworthy to challenge its waters. Tonight, we'll be going into the depths, so hold on to your life vests and prepare yourselves to let the darkness take control. The ocean is a beautiful and thoroughly dangerous place. I learnt this the year of my 21st birthday while serving aboard a frigate in the United States Navy. My ship and my home. The USS Clifton Sprague. It was a guided missile frigate. As Navy ships go, she was not very big, frigates being the smallest ships of the line in the fleet, measuring only 445 feet from stern to stem. She was a good ship though, and we had a commanding officer who fully intended to prove it, due to his determination to show what a fine ship he had. I found the ship and myself steaming full speed into the teeth of a storm, which raged off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia in the North Atlantic in late fall of 1988. The weather reports were saying that Tropical Storm Keith had not dissipated as expected, but had pushed further north than any other storm that season. Late November was too late to be weathering a storm in the frigid North Atlantic. I thought of all the stories I had heard about how the Canadian Navy was supposed to welcome us to this multinational fleet NATO event that we were to attend in Halifax. I had also heard that Canadian girls were friendly and that Canadian ships supposedly had beer pubs in them, but at that moment I had no way to prove either of these two superstitions true, because instead of a warm woman or bar stool, I instead found myself perched atop my frigid ship's bridge, standing a forward lookout, watching in a driving sleet storm, with 30-knot winds in heavy seas. What I was certain of was that I was wearing 7 layers of clothing, most of it labelled extreme foul weather gear, and I was still learning about what freezing to death means when it's not just an expression. Upon reviewing the newest weather advisors, the captain had decided it best remain at sea, because a ship in port during a storm merely gets beaten up against a pier until either the ship or the pier breaks. Since Canada routinely has lousy weather, they build sturdy piers, so we took our chances with the storm. Just after noon, the winds and the sea begin to really pick up, and soon we were in that undulating mode wherein one only really gets to test the durability of their sea legs and their stomach. As I had walked through the ship from my berthing space towards my watch station earlier in the evening, I had paid little heed to the fact that sometimes my footfalls landed on the deck, and sometimes on the bulkheads of the ship rocked beneath me. I also paid no notice to the ever-present sounds of the ship, the jet whine of the gas turbines, the thrum of the waves on the hull, the comforting hum of the generators, or even the occasional ping from the sonar. My attention was on the smells from which one learns to pick up great deals of information. I noticed that sometime tomorrow, the galley would be serving blueberry pie. The smell of the fuel oils, sampled with the oil lab, seemed lardy enough for me to know that the fuel level in our tanks was much lower than it should be in a storm. The smell of hot coffee from the mess decks filled my nostrils as I tanked up my cup, and the combined aromas of paint, sweat, and cigarettes rounded out my card-playing shipmate's contribution to this nautical bouquet. I walked the rest of the ladders, and a passage towards the bridge through the warm, welcoming, almost uterine interior of the ship. It was lit in soft red light to preserve the lookout's night vision. How I now missed that warmth and light amid the dark, cold, wet misery of my bridge-top watch station. My face crusted with ice around my nose and mouth. I swept my goggles off and spat into them, hearing the small snap as the spittle flash froze to the glass. I quickly tried to rub it around before it froze too solid, then disgustedly jammed the things on top of my head between my scalp and parka hood, where they might warm a bit. I knew my vision wouldn't last long without them, in the most inhospitable of environments. The sea rolled like a great grey blanket, being shaken out onto an even greater bed, usually appearing solidly black as night. Now every wavy surface seemed to be alive with foamy phosphorescence, so great was the sea state. The distance between the crest of a wave and its adjacent trough was easily 35 to 40 feet. I had never seen 40-foot waves at sea before, and I wished that I had saved that first time for a ship a bit more substantial than the tin can I called home. I had only been going to sea with our Navy for a little over a year at that point, but I was well aware that the floor of the North Atlantic was profusely littered with rotted and rusting monuments to mankind's hubris. As I pondered this, squinting through salt-frozen lashes at the glowing and roaring wave tops, the sea looked and sounded to me like nothing more than a great grinder, ready to pulverize me ship and all. It was at that moment that directly ahead of the ship, a brilliant stroke of lightning struck down into the wave. But this was not just any wave. Mariners call them rogue waves. This wave, larger than any around it, towered 50 feet higher than our main deck. This wave was a killer. Time stood still. Framed in that bolt of lightning, which seemed to claw its way down into the sea, forking and branching and turning that monstrous wave into a giant mountain of emerald and jade with its glowing striations. In an instant, its horrible beauty was gone, forever burned into my memory, but lost into my retinas, and replaced with after-image blindness. I smelled the ozone from the lightning. I screamed, "Rogue wave, death ahead," into my comm, but the bridge crew had seen it as well. Who could miss a giant, glowing, green mountain, which was about to fall on you? I was blinded, but through the soles of my boots, I felt the sensation you get at the beach when an incoming wave pulls the water from under your sandy feet towards the sea. Except this was a lot bigger than a beach wave, and I felt the deck drop out from under my feet as millions of tons of water rushed to feed the behemoth. The ship practically fell into the wave bow on, and as she plowed in, the wave broke over where I stood, 3 stories up from the main deck. If not for my safety strap, I would have been lost, as over 100 feet of bow forwards of the superstructure speared into that wave. And when the green water broke over the windbreak, it was like colliding with a wall. The hull rang from the impact. The ship lost almost all forward momentum, and for a moment, I felt she might be foundering. The bridge crew told me later that the bridge windows were briefly totally submerged, and for that unnerving moment, they had all looked up to see the surface. But then the ship began to groan and shudder along with her whole length as she shouldered upwards, shedding countless tons of water from her decks. Ship and crew had survived. There were other waves that night, but I was positive that I knew which one had left the inch-wide cracks in the superstructure. I came to know that the ocean is very deadly, and its alluring beauty and magnetism are rivaled only by its brutality and mercilessness. Prior to joining the US Navy, my grandfather took me aside and told me several stories of his time spent in the Navy during World War II. This was his way of ensuring I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. My grandfather was a weapons technician too in World War II, aboard the destroyer USS Maury, DD-401, from 1942 to 1945, and manned a 5-inch over .38 caliber cannon. He survived Pearl Harbor, Battle over Tarawa, and Battle of Midway, as well as the invasion of Luzon, to name a few, with only a small shrapnel wound to his leg in all that time. I'd like to share some of the stories that just blew my mind to this day. August 21st, 1943, in a location west-southwest of Nendo Island, Solomons, the ship USS Maury, DD-401 destroyer. The Maury was escorting an Australian vessel to Espiritu Santo, as Japanese forces were still active in the area, and Allied forces were actively attempting to keep Guadalcanal and the Solomons secure after previous weeks of battle with the Japanese forces. The night was clear, with every star in the sky. The wind was so low that you could hear gulls fishing off in the distance, and the wakes splashing against the hulls of the ships. The air felt like Hawaii in spring, and all you wanted to do was bask in the moonglow. Suddenly, voice radio communications from nearby Allied island bases started chirping away with information about visual confirmation of enemy subs in the area to the north. Soon after, the all-on-deck order was given, and everyone was forced to stand ready. A team was assigned light patrol, and they began panning around looking for subs. Not more than 2 hours go by, with no visual contact made. They are finally given the order to stand down and return to shut-eye duty. Before daybreak, contacts from Nendo Island start coming on voice comms, warning that potentials are flying around in the area just 5 miles south of Maury's escort position. Already worried that they may have been targeted by Japanese subs from their bow, they now have to contend with a potential aerial assault, and everyone is called to stand ready once more. Engines are killed, emergency lights activated, and orders given to kill all lights. My grandfather, manning his light, is immediately ordered to put the candle out, and pushes the searchlight straight down into the water, turning it off. When they finally stop moving, the crew can hear the low-tone humming of several planes passing parallel to their position. Everyone holds their breath and pretends to pretty much not exist, hoping the enemy doesn't make visual contact with the ship. So for a good 45 minutes, everyone just sits there, until they can no longer make audible contact with their enemy forces they hoped would pass. Finally, after almost 2 hours of nothing, they are given the go-ahead and start the engines and return to the passage. My grandfather flicks his cigarette port side and clicks on the searchlight, still pointing into the water. What he says he saw next aged him and 2 others with him a good 10 years. Below, where the searchlight sat, focused in the water, lay an eyeball the size of a basketball, sitting there, staring straight back at him from about 10 feet underwater. The next 3 seconds lasted minutes in his mind, as he watched this silvery disc of an eye look straight through him. Finally, the first of the engines started in what seemed like forever, and the beast that it was broke surface for a brief moment in order to dive deep. Even before people acknowledged giant squids existed, before they were even caught on camera, my grandfather believed because he had seen one within 20 feet of his face. In my 8 years of service, I have heard many stories of such things, and even own a few teeth pulled from the rubber liner of a ship, but never had any such experiences myself. Adding that experience in lieu of the drama of war, and you can get a sense for the true terror it would invoke. My grandfather, now 93, is still alive and kicking, even though dementia is heavy, and he seems to live in the past. It's still good to know that there are still some heroes in this world. Thanks to all that served, and thanks for listening. Number 3. I am an open water kayaker, and I took a trip to Charleston, South Carolina for a weekend of fun paddling around the harbor and the Barrier Islands. There is an inlet between the Isle of Psalms and Sullivan's Island, known as Breach's Inlet, where there have been quite a few deaths due to the extremely strong and unpredictable rip currents. What better place to go play in a boat, right? Part of the trouble with the inlet is that you have the current coming out of Charleston Harbor in one direction, the general coastline current in another direction, and the current flowing out of the inlet itself in a third direction. All of these currents come together and make some fantastic waves to play on. I was in a used Neko Elaho HV kayak I had recently purchased from a closing kayak shop's rental fleet. The boat is about 15.7 feet long, but is surprisingly nimble for its size. Definitely a fun but stable surf boat. Before this incident, I had only had the boat on pretty flat water, inland lakes and large rivers with no real rapids, and had experienced no problems with the boat. The difference here is that with all of the different currents, there were large waves breaking over me in multiple directions. On the lakes I was used to paddling, the biggest waves I might encounter was the wake from a passing redneck in a boat. In Breach's Inlet, I was now faced with 6 to 8 foot waves crashing and breaking from multiple directions, sometimes all at once. I have been here before in my other boat with no problem. This is a fun place to paddle, but I did not realize that this boat had a hidden problem. There is a large watertight compartment in both the bow and the stern of the boat, meant for flotation, but commonly used for storage of equipment for excursion paddling. Each compartment has a hatch cover made of neoprene, with a sturdy bead around the edge, like a bicycle tire, to fit snugly around the coaming of the hatch, and then loosely covered with a hard plastic hatch cover to protect the neoprene. What I didn't realize was that the bead on the rear hatch's neoprene cover had broken, and although it appeared to be holding normally, from a quick visual inspection, it was, in reality, barely able to hold itself in place. In flat water, this wasn't a problem, since waves were not breaking over the top of the boat. There was never any additional pressures on the hatch cover to make the problem apparent. Unfortunately, I am now 3/4 of a mile out into the ocean in the middle of one of the most dangerous currents on the eastern coast, with waves crashing against me regularly. The hatch cover did not hold. There was a noise. There wasn't a shudder, there wasn't a crack. There wasn't an indication that there was any kind of problem. I noticed that it became a little more sluggish to steer, but I initially attributed that to tiring from a long day of paddling. Then I noticed that the waves were crashing over me more and more. At first I thought this was due to the changing tides increasing the wave action, but I slowly began to notice that I was riding lower and lower in the water. I still wasn't too concerned, but I was starting to pay more attention. What finally made me realize I was in trouble was when each passing wave would actually turn me into it as I passed. I was having little luck steering the boat at all. This is when I noticed that the rear deck was almost totally awash. So much of the boat was now underwater that instead of floating above the waves, I was now in them, and they were pushing the boat. Now, I'm 3/4 of a mile out with a boat that is nearly uncontrollable and extremely sluggish and tippy due to the several hundred pounds of water now residing in my rear, non-watertight compartment with 6 to 8 foot waves hitting me in every direction. I can honestly say that this is the only time I have been truly scared in one of my boats. I was not sure I would be able to make it to shore. For every paddle stroke that I tried to make toward shore, I would have to take 3 or 4 more to correct my course from passing waves turning me. Due to the additional mass of water, it took 4 strokes or more to be as efficient as one is normally. It felt like every other stroke I had to brace to prevent capsizing. I was in real trouble. It took me over an hour to reach the shore. That distance in those waters should have only taken about 5 minutes, and I was finally helped the last 50 meters by a passing boat. I had attracted a small crowd on the beach, and not long before I landed, someone had finally thought to call for help. They arrived about 10 minutes after I made it to the shore. I carry a VFH radio with me, but by the time I realized I was in trouble, I couldn't take my hands off the paddle long enough to use it. When I landed, the boat was at a 30-degree angle, since the only flotation I had remaining was the front compartment. The rear compartment was completely filled with water, and I did not paddle this boat again until that rear hatch cover was replaced. Number 4. For a couple of months last year, I lived in South Africa and did marine research with some of the people who make Shark Week. The work involved sailing out each morning, attracting sharks to the research vessel, which is around 21 feet with 2 engines, and then collecting data about them by various means. Going into this project, I had very little knowledge of marine biology, and as a result, I was usually relegated the role of chummer. This lucky individual has the role of grinding up large quantities of rotting sardine heads and continuously pouring them off the side of the boat to attract white sharks. My experience took place on the first time I went chumming. It was a beautiful summer morning, and we had just set out in one of the primary research locations, a reef colloquially referred to as Shark City by the locals. The seas were unusually rough, and we were reaching quite large waves hitting the beach, about a third of a mile from where we had laid anchor. The process of grinding up rotting fish involves the chum dance, standing in a rectangular container in a pair of rain boots. I was crushing the fishy remains whilst dancing to Michael Jackson's Thriller, a favourite amongst the researchers. Just as the chum dance reached its finale, a fair amount of rotting sardine was in the water. The crow's nest spotter hastily points to a white glimmer just a few feet from our starboard side. We had gotten lucky. A 15-foot female great white had come to investigate the fishy carnage. Contrary to popular belief, white sharks don't circle boats near the surface with their fins above water. They are indeed ambush hunters, swimming in sporadic patterns around prey, diving to depths below sight, and then eventually striking in a rush from below. We researchers, me in particular, considering I had never even seen a shark before, were giddy as this large female made a few loops around the vessel before disappearing into the iron-green abyss. About a minute later, as I was peering off the side, still standing in the chum container, I noticed that the jovial South African laughter behind me had abruptly stopped. I turned around to see a large wave, about 10 to 15 feet, coming in quickly on our broad side. In the few seconds before adrenaline set in, I remember seeing the wall of water crashing over me, spinning, floating. I had been flung overboard by the freak wave. Dear listeners, at this point in the story you must consider who I was at the time. A jet-lagged, somewhat nerdy, skinny American teenage boy, outside the USA for the first time. There I was, floating in the South African Sea, a couple thousand miles from home, in a cloud of rotting sardine matter. Ah yes, the chum container had been flung off the boat with me, with a 15-foot great white shark swimming probably a few yards below. I have very little memory of the next few seconds, a mind clouded by adrenaline. My salvation came in the form of a large arm that pulled me back aboard the boat, which had luckily not capsized. Oh, what a joyous breath of salty ocean air I breathed then. I can think of a few good things that came out of that sharky episode. For one, it accelerated my getting to know the researchers who, presumably, as a result of our mutual peril, welcomed me with open arms for the rest of my time in Africa. The large shark, which has been seen regularly to this day in Shark City, was named after me. Finally, this experience gave me the opportunity to share this notice with you all. Sharks are incredible creatures. They should be respected, admired, and protected. I'm not going to tell you that they should be feared. They definitely should be, to a healthy extent. However, when you consider how many people are killed each year in shark attacks, versus how many sharks are slaughtered for sport, trophies, or fins, you realize that we are indeed the greater threat to them than they are to us. You've probably heard all of this before, but I think it's still worth it to say. Number 5. A couple of years ago, I was sailing on a ship that maneuvered offshore with pipeline that ran to shore about half a mile off. As the ship was unhooking from the pipe, the line that was used to haul the pipe to the ship connection got wrapped around a person's leg and sucked him through the rails. He fell about 30 feet into freezing water, and the general alarm sounded for a man overboard, which woke me up at around 5. I woke up all confused to find everyone frantically running around on deck. Once I realized it was no drill, I ran to the starboard side, and there were around 3 life rings in the water, and one was around 3 feet from the guy, but he couldn't reach it. He had a work vest on that was keeping him afloat. Hypothermia had set in, and he was moving slow and was yelling for help. At this point it was clear he wasn't grabbing the life rings, so half the crew and I ran over to the rescue boat to unhook it, while the other half tried getting him on the ship. It seemed like it took forever to get the rescue boat down. The hold-down straps were rusted and took a bit to get off. The cover was still on the boat, and it was a bitch to get off, and the hoist is the slowest hoist, which seemed to take 10 minutes to finally get into the water. Finally, we get 2 guys in the rescue boat, in the water, and let the bow line off, and then the rescue boat engine cuts out. Luckily, it started right up again. At that point, I ran back to the starboard side, and everyone was yelling, "Where is he?" One of the mates said, "We had him on the ladder, but his leg is still caught in that line. We couldn't get it free, and he got sucked under the ship." At this point, everyone seemed to go silent. I looked down and saw the guy's boot float by. The next guy came to me and said, "He's gone." After a few nerve-wracking seconds, the crew in the rescue boat radioed that they found the guy bobbing in the water face down and still attached to the hoist line. He was unconscious and not breathing. At this point, the rescue crew tried pulling the guy on board, and with the swell of the sea and the way the boat hit his chest, made him spit up water and come to. The radio crew radioed back that he was conscious. The line was removed from his leg, and he was pulled fully onto the boat. The boat headed straight to shore where the beach crew and an ambulance were waiting. They were able to get the guy some coats and put them on him, and he was conscious enough to understand what was going on but not to speak. The ambulance took him, where he was sent to the ER for hypothermia and drowning. The guy's life vest saved his life in more ways than one. It kept him afloat and kept him visible. I say it kept him visible because if you blinked and he didn't have a life vest on, you would have never seen him again. Things luckily didn't result in a death, but easily could have, due to the temperature of water, visibility, equipment failure, and reaction time. This is the scariest thing that has ever happened to me while sailing, and the look of terror on the guy's face is still with me, and the feeling of utter hopelessness to help, even though he was a mere few feet from the ship. He spent a few days in the hospital, and miraculously suffered no serious injuries, except near death. Number 6. I was in the US Navy for 6 years, stationed on an aircraft carrier for 4 of those. This is the scariest thing that happened to me. Our ship caught fire off the coast of Chile after a port call there. We were offloading fuel to another ship, and they called over to tell us that we had smoke coming out of the hull, so they were breaking away until we figured it out. A fire is not the sort of thing you want going on during a jet fuel transfer. A few fires started getting called away, so the captain announced that we were going to general quarters. I thought it wasn't serious for a while. Over the past few weeks, people had been calling away the fire team for little trash can fires, so I figured this was just a few of those, coincidentally happening at the same time. After about an hour, I realized that we were still at general quarters, and the announcements were pretty intense. I saw a few people running past, and apparently, there was a fire that started in the ventilation ducts and had spread all throughout the ship. I offered help and just started running SCBA breathing tanks back and forth to the refuel stations so the firefighters could keep fighting the fire. We had 4 crewmen that had been trapped at one point, and we had to cut through a bulkhead or an internal wall to get them out. In the end, the worst injuries were just second-degree burns and heat exhaustion. We lost one of the reactors and a lot of office equipment. We limped up to San Diego and were there for 3 months because the repairs were so extensive. After everything was done, I read the report, and based on what I know about the events of that day, it turns out we were a hair away from losing the ship. We had 1 reactor remaining to power the ship, and some of the cabling to the emergency diesel generators had melted, meaning they wouldn't have received a start signal if the other reactor failed, meaning we may not have had enough power to finish fighting the fires. It was a really close call, because we almost lost the reactor a few times. It was down to 2 coolant loops, which is not a very good place for those reactors to be. The fire started because some people were keeping oily rags in a ventilation room and used that room as a smoke pit. Idiots. Number 7. In 2008, my wife and I left California on a 40-foot sailboat, intending to sail as far west as we could. We spent weeks at a time, without contact from another human being. Shortwave radio was often our only link to civilization, and eventually, we were too south for even that. We passed New Caledonia, and we didn't know what to expect as we approached Australia in the 3rd year of our tour. Of course, the Great Barrier Reef was on our charts, but we were sticking to shipping lanes to avoid grounding. So I was stunned when I took watch one calm morning and noticed a dark brown shape below the horizon. To the west and south seemed to be a massive sandbar or island that had risen out of nowhere. The sea was calm and the winds so light we cranked the engine and motored the last mile to this uncharted barrier. As we got closer, it became clear that it fortunately wasn't above the surface, but it looked like a brown reef, or mass of log that was only a few inches below the surface. But how could a reef so massive not exist on any chart? We swerved right, and looking for channels or breaks in the bar, but our depth sounder stayed pegged, so we had nothing to guide us through. We had no way of asking anyone whether it was safe to proceed, so when the reef no longer had any gaps to aim for, we tentatively poked the bow into it, with the engine in neutral. No grinding, no shudder, just silence as the reef enveloped us, and our finicky depth sounder still stared back at us blankly. So I ran to the transom, intending to pull on a mask and look below, but then I saw it was just a brownish tint in the water, some chemical or brown oil. Wary that it was a dangerous chemical spill or weapons testing gone wrong, I dipped a bottle into it and tried to sample it without getting any on my hands. We continued puttering through this ocean of brown for miles and miles, before it eventually dropped away behind us as abruptly as it had appeared. I went ashore with my sample and intended to ask a customs agent about it. The other sailors at the dock were oblivious. They didn't see anything like it on their passage, never in their years of sailing these waters. But luckily, a wizened old man at the docks set me straight before I went insane with conspiracy theories. Turns out, we'd just caught the Great Barrier Reef in its annual orgy. The brown colour in the water was the spore of the reef that it releases all at once across the entire continental shelf of Australia. And this year, in Queensland, we had calm weather with little churning to dissipate the massive cloud of life. Number 8. I circumnavigated the globe from the ages of 23 to 25 on a 43-foot sailboat. One of the freakiest incidences we had on board was when we were leaving Singapore in the middle of the night. Aside from the constant game of Frogger dodging freights on our path, it was fairly straightforward. At around 3 a.m, I was alone at the helm, with everybody else asleep down below. Suddenly, I hear a beep from the radar, which had been set to warn about anything within a quarter of a mile from our vessel. Looking around, I couldn't find anything obvious within that range, so I put the boat on autopilot and went down below to investigate. Typically, other ships show up as little blobs, but for some reason, the radar was registering a long solid line the length of the screen directly in front of us, and it was getting closer fast. Heart racing, I went back on deck to see what could possibly be registering as such a bizarre signature. Eyes slowly adjusting, I looked into the dark, peering as hard as I could to make out something, anything, and then I saw it. Not more than 100 yards ahead was a 20-foot high, unlit, rock-solid wall, right there in the middle of the ocean, looming, and by this point, making its presence known by the sound of waves lapping against it. I was absolutely petrified. Mind you, this was before chart plotters were widely used, and we were navigating with paper charts. I was utterly confused and supremely terrified. I called all hands on deck, and we stopped the boat dead, pulled down the sails and started the engine. Slowly, painstakingly, we picked our way through what was by that time increasingly apparent, a full-on construction zone. Our charts were only 2 years old, but apparently Singapore had undergone a monumental land reclamation, or perhaps nuclamation, since it had never been there to begin with. Even once we found our way out, nobody slept for the rest of the night. To this day, the image of magically appearing dark walls in the middle of the ocean still haunts my dreams. Number 9. I have spent a lot of time at sea, fishing, usually only for a 5 to 8 hour journey, within 25 kilometers of shore. But I have also worked on long-line commercial vessels that stayed out at sea for 3 to 6 days at a time, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers from shore. Nevertheless, the scariest moment for me, ever, was probably when I was around 12 years old, fishing with an old friend of my grandpa. He was a lifelong fishing expert and a local, at 80-odd years of age. What he didn't know about local fishing wasn't worth knowing, although he only used hand lines. He had some kind of commercial license that allowed him to sell his modest catch. Since we shared a strong enthusiasm for fishing, and he could sell what I caught, minus a fish or two, he regularly let me come out with him. It was a clear day, and the water was calm. We were in a fairly small craft. For simplicity, imagine Popeye's boat, the Olive, a diesel-powered, mid-engined boat with a deep hull, small cabin, and very short overall. maybe 7 meters, 22 feet. We anchored about 2 kilometers from shore in about 45 meters of water. Our target was usually snapper. These guys can grow to over a meter long and weigh up to 20 kg. Amazing fun on a handline. I used gloves. He didn't. Anyhow, during a lull in the action, I was daydreaming and staring over the edge of the boat in the depths below. It took me a moment to register when I realized a large shape passed under me. It was deep enough that I had only got an outline and sense of movement. I paused and stared. What had I just seen? Then the tail passed. My heart stopped. My blood turned to ice. I realized I had been staring down onto the back of an animal so large that I had temporarily thought it wasn't actually there. It was so large that my mind had time to run through a series of processes before I realized something was still passing me, and there goes its tail. Roy? I think I just saw a shark, I stammered. Of course, this was not unusual, and we regularly pulled them on board. But there must have been some extra information etched on my face that he registered. I was probably as white as a ghost. So Roy gets up and starts looking around. For a minute, there was nothing to be seen. We took turns looking over each side of the boat. And there it was, a real-life monster. An enormous 7-meter great white shark. I can still recall the feeling of 12-year-old horror. It looked up at me. It saw me. Its face and head were covered in scars, and there were many old injuries all over the entirety of its body. For me, nothing I have experienced since can compare to the eye-to-eye encounter for sheer terror. It passed under the boat again. My panic was escalating. In what seemed like an instant, the old man Roy was raising the anchor. It was then I realized he was almost as scared as I was. My bladder almost let go. How could he be scared? We are safe, aren't we, Roy? It can't get us up here, right? That is the one that rams boats, boy. And I can't swim. Now, as an adult, I understand that a shark would have a hard time capsizing such a vessel. But that did not change the fact that I was 12 years old, and I had just a face-to-face encounter with Satan, who was currently under the boat. And that was that. In moments, we were puttering back towards port, far too slowly. I think I still have PTSD almost 3 decades later, and I still search the water for the shark, even today. Number 10. This story is my grandfather's, who was a chief engineer on a trawler ship operating out of Hull. He was fishing at night off the coast of Norway in the 70s when a call came on radio. Worth noting, it was an open secret that all the radio operators on the trawlers worked for the government and also had sonar equipment to listen for USSR subs, to evacuate an 100-mile area, and if the trawlers could not get their nets up in time, to get the hell out of there, or they should just cut them free, which was very expensive to do when you have dozens of miles of nets out in the water. On the way out, my grandfather's trawler and other trawlers in the area saw a massive white flash on the horizon. After returning to Hull, it was discovered that a ship called the Gaul had never returned and had lost all radio contact around the time of the flash. Fast forward 20 or so years later, and the wreckage of the Gaul was discovered and officially sank because of a waste flow pipe being overwhelmed with a massive wave that flooded the lower compartment of the ship and sent her to the bottom. Rather interestingly, there were no human remains found on or near the ship, nor any equipment, food, bedding, etc., and all the windows had been blown outwards, along with the hole about 3 meters across through the middle of the ship, with all the metalwork being twisted upwards towards the sky. My grandfather always insisted, up until his dying day, that the sea that night was as still as a pond, and that his radio operator was fairly sure that the "get the hell out of there" warning came from the Gaul, as well as the time of Gaul sinking. 16 unknown graves were created and filled in Murmansk, Russia. Another one of his favourite stories was that one day the engine for hauling in nets was redlining and came very close to exploding, so had to be shut off, as they assumed the nets got stuck at the bottom. A few minutes later, a Soviet sub surfaced from beneath them, with the nets stuck to the periscope, complete with a bunch of very pissed off Soviet sailors armed with guns, who unhooked the nets and disappeared back under the water. It was a known tactic that Soviet subs tried to sit under the trawlers and use them as cover to get out into the Atlantic. Hence a lot of the ships having government-paid radio operators on board. Bonus story. My wife and I were honeymooning in St. Lucia 8 years ago. The resort we stayed at offered a catamaran cruise to the Pitons. It was great. Free drinks, great scenery, the weather was perfect, and the cruise drops us off at some town to check out the sulfur volcano and waterfall. The time comes to board for the 3 ride back to the resort. I say to my wife, I really want to sit up by the cargo net at the bow to get the breeze and the spray so we can cool off. Of course, she wants to sit somewhere else. We almost break into a mini argument, and while that was going on, another couple grabs the spot. No big deal. We find a spot a little behind where I wanted to be. About halfway back, some kind of game fish leaps out the sea, through the cargo net, and literally into the lap of the guy of the couple who wound up sitting where we wanted to sit. Everyone is kind of amazed at first. Then the guy starts wrestling with whatever kind of fish it was. I couldn't quite figure out what it was. It all happened kind of quick. It was around 3 to 4 feet long and seemed to be about 40 to 50 pounds. After around 4 to 5 seconds, the fish drops back through the net and this guy's wife starts screaming. Blood is pouring out of this guy's leg. Being pretty much right behind him, I got a good look at the 5-inch gash the fish's fins must have put into him. I could see that fatty looking substance and knew things had gone pretty bad. He managed to get his feet diced up too. The boat had to pull off at the next resort and drop off this couple so he could get immediate medical attention. We could hear the sirens making their way towards us as we shoved off again. And to top it all off, we saw him at the airport when we were leaving about 4 days later, in a wheelchair. Not the way you want to spend your honeymoon, but I was glad he made it through. To this day, I still think that my wife or I should have been the ones in the wheelchair, or worse. Safe to say my wife has won every argument that has taken place since this incident. Hey guys, so here is a second bonus story, just to lighten the mood at the end of the video. I'm pretty sure you'll all like it. Some years ago, when I was 8 years old, my grandfather asked me if I would like to go fishing with him on his little motorboat, a couple of miles offshore in the Atlantic. It was a beautiful clear day, and after getting the green light from my parents, I was buzzing to go. The allure of spending some quality time with my grandfather on crystal clear waters was too good to resist. 8-year-old me was also thrilled with the prospect of catching a fish. I remember brimming with excitement. I had a friend at school who told me how he had caught a huge fish, and I really wanted to outdo him. I truly expected to have incredible luck and catch a whopper to not only impress my grandfather, my friends, but my whole family. All of these thoughts rushed through my mind as we reached the, quite frankly, underwhelming motorboat. So we jumped in, and he gave me the rundown on what we had to do, and of course, the obligatory safety procedure consisting of stay out the water, don't take the life vest off. He revved up the engine, and away we went, jetting through the crystal sea, leaving waves in our wake as we blasted through. It was almost as if we were flying on the waves. The excitement was palpable. When we finally reached a good spot, we threw out a line and waited patiently. I grew frustrated, catching nothing at all in the first hour, and my disappointment was very visible on my 8-year-old face. I got that feeling that told me that I would never catch anything. I'm not sure why. And then I felt a huge disappointment. I wouldn't be able to outdo my friend. My emotions were very clearly visible on my 8-year-old face, and despite the fact that my grandfather had also caught absolutely nothing, he was still very chipper about the whole situation. I suppose this is probably because he was a seasoned fisherman and understood the complexities of fishing, and that patience is probably your greatest asset. However, being 8 years old, this of course didn't resonate with me at all. Once he noticed the onset of prepubescent moodiness, he decided that we should call it a day. So he tried firing up the engine so that we could leave. And no luck, it wouldn't start. After 15 minutes of effort, and cursing the likes of which I've never heard, he undid the clamp holding the motor on and dropped it to the bottom of the ocean. At this very moment, I thought he had signed our death warrants, but he pulled out 2 oars from underneath, and then he started rowing back. Unfortunately though, he popped out a mile offshore, and we were being carried rapidly towards some exposed rocks. I knew for a fact that we were in very serious danger, and that hitting them was almost certain, and that drowning would shortly follow. It was by sheer luck that a large motor yacht approached. I started jumping up and down, screaming for help. Our salvation was nigh. But Gramps told me to sit down and shut up. Because apparently, it's the law of the sea that if you ask for help, the person giving you aid claimed your boat. So we waited until they offered help and got towed in. If they'd have waited any longer, I'm sure that boat wouldn't have made it back to shore. We made it back fine, but I'll always remember that as the day I almost drowned, because Grandpa was willing to scuttle his motor, but not his boat. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed these stories in the video. They are some of the most challenging stories to find, especially trying to exclude the ones that are just about cruise ships, but are seriously scary. Always remember to respect the sea. The water is unforgiving and can swallow you up to never be seen or heard from again, regardless of how big your boat is. I would seriously appreciate it if you could drop a like on this video and leave a comment with your thoughts. It won't take you very long, and it would seriously help me out. Thanks guys. Don't forget that if you would like me to read your story on my channel, feel free to send it to my email, or share it to my Reddit, which is of course available in the description. Just please be sure to include as much description and punctuation as possible, to maximize the chances of it being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.